therein lies part of the challenge, because you can't give all sides the same information necessarily, because obviously the information you talk to with executive leadership sometimes is classified, and you can't give that necessarily to the public, but you can still have the same conversation without providing classified information. And so that's how you have to thread that needle. And it's a constant, I guess you could call it spinning of plates. And hopefully you don't drop any of them. And so it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, and a lot of coordination for each one of those. This is what I don't think people understand when you look at the collective achievements or accomplishments we collectively have made, all of us, over the last 4 years. Each one of those bullets is hundreds, if not sometimes 1,000 hours working behind the scenes to make things happen. It's a lot of work.
Is there any evidence that these, whatever we want to call them, aliens, creatures, future humans, whatever we want, let's label them X, is there any evidence that these X can shapeshift, can look like other humans or other creatures?
I don't know, but I'll tell you, mimicry is something that is common in nature, and it's even common in what we do. There are species to defend themselves in the animal kingdom. Let's take a coral snake versus, let's say, a king snake. The coral snake is very deadly. The king snake has the same colors, except for some of the color arrangements are in opposite order. And these animals mimic other animals for protection. Now, let's look at it from a humanistic perspective. We have something where we call light deception on, for example, Navy ships. In the old days, we would string lights in a way that would try at night to make a big, large destroyer appear to be a fishing boat, right? A trawler. And we light deception is part of camouflage, part of survival. So if there is a species that is far more advanced than human beings, it's not inconceivable. Look, we can go to the panda exhibit in the zoo in China and see that zookeepers will often wear these kind of, it appears ridiculous to us, but not so ridiculous to the pandas. The zookeepers are required to wear a panda suit, a big furry teddy bear suit.
Interesting.
Yeah, they do that. So when they go into the enclosure to clean up the enclosure or whatnot, provide food, they don't disrupt the local panda population as least as possible. Of course, it's entertaining to us to see a bunch of humans walking around in furry panda suits, but at the end of the day, it's effective. So, I don't think it's inconceivable. The problem is when we start going down the road of, we say shape shifting and things like that, immediately we start going into the world of woo, quote unquote, and paranormal. And again, there's nothing wrong with it. I've written articles on paranormal, right? Everything by definition in science is paranormal until it becomes normal, frankly. So, but the problem is that we don't have hard evidence. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence. A lot of people report seeing things that the UAP can look like an aircraft, sometimes disguise itself like a 747, or that the occupants can make themselves look like human beings. I don't really know. During our time at ATIP, we were focused primarily on the nuts and bolts of this, and what our military eyewitnesses and collection capabilities were telling us. At the time, we didn't really have any reports of quote unquote shape-shifting. Now, cloaking, that's a different story. We do have some information that indicates that these things do have an ability to try to evade some of our sensors. And for example, radar. You get these nonsensical, what looks like spoofing or radar jamming occurring. You have the low observability portion of the 5 observables is that includes things like active camouflage and cloaking and again, low observability. It's hard to see. And so that there is information that we have that pertains to that.
Okay, speaking about cloaking, is there any evidence that suggests, UFOs are associated with orbs, at least anecdotally? Firstly, what's the reason for that? And then second, is there any evidence that that suggests that these orbs may be more plentiful than we think, perhaps around us, whether in homes or outside cityscapes, just cloaked?
Yeah, the problem with orb, the word orb is you're not going to get a common definition from most people. Everybody thinks an orb means something else. Some people think an orb is a little plasma ball. Others say it's much bigger and intelligently controlled. Orb is kind of a general catch-all. When you say is an orb related to UFO, well, by definition, it is a UFO. It's unidentified and it's flying, or it's in our atmosphere, and it's an object. It's something. We don't know what it is. So by definition, an orb is a UAP. But the question is it a UAP in the sense that we're talking about UAPs, whether lenticular type shape or maybe a cylindrical shape or a triangular vehicle? I think the jury's still out. There does seem to be some information that suggests that orbs, as you call them, are sometimes associated with other UAP sightings, that there are UAPs in the sky, and then you see these little balls of light. You know, the problem is it's a very generalized term. We now know for a fact that things such as ball lightning are real. Is that an orb? Well, yeah, times it looks like an orb to me. Other times when you have large amounts of energy being released into the atmosphere and the environment. Let's talk about tectonic movement, for example, where these titanic forces right underneath the surface of the Earth, creating this plasma effect in the atmosphere, where you get these different colors shooting into the sky, and again, orbs, if you will, being reported and seen and even captured on camera. But that's an orb that I think we can all agree is probably being manufactured naturally. Now, are there orbs that are intelligently controlled? Well, we did talk about that at ATIP. One of the questions were, when you look at the different shapes and sizes of vehicles, orbs tend to be almost like I guess in a vernacular sense, think of a UAV, think of a drone. They tend to be described as being much smaller, highly maneuverable, different colors, sometimes red, sometimes green, sometimes yellow, sometimes blue. Is it possible that those colors are indicative of mission set, right? Is it, are the blue ones doing certain things where the reds are doing something else and their purpose is something else, where the yellows and whites are doing something else? It's certainly plausible. I don't dismiss that at all. The problem is we just don't have enough information, because it appears that these orbs tend to be small, that it's really hard to argue the case that they are being occupied by any type of biological organism. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not. It just means that, we haven't seen that yet. We don't know what these are. Are these perhaps some sort of unmanned reconnaissance capability that are kicked out? Not much different than we use drones ourselves, right, to do certain types of reconnaissance missions. We don't know. It's certainly plausible.
The reasoning behind my question is that Tom DeLonge, I recall, was saying one shouldn't do CE5. I'm going to get you to explain what CE5 is. But anyway, one shouldn't do CE5. And when one does it, often orbs are associated with it, and one thinks, oh, that's great because I'm inducing some contact. And Tom said, be careful. One shouldn't do that lightly. So that to me implies that there's something nefarious or potentially nefarious about these orbs.
Well, I mean, look, I'd say the same thing. Don't mess around with electricity unless you're a licensed electrician. Be careful, because you can get zapped. That's true with anything. That's not just orbs. That's electricity. That's swimming pools. That's everything. I can't speak for Tom. I don't know what Tom meant by that, but I can tell you that general word of caution, I think, is appropriate for just about anything out there. If you don't know what you're getting into, just be mindful. There are potentially things that go bump in the night, and it's not all necessarily good or bad.
Is there information being recorded or being encoded into less mainstream information media channels that can be parsed out, John Nash style, like A Beautiful Mind, that could help us arrive closer at the truth of this phenomenon?
So I'm going to need your help, Curt, kind of detangling that question, because I'm not familiar with the reference. But when you're saying encoded, can you repeat that question one more time? I want to answer it, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question.
Okay, just deciphering. Essentially, with someone of sufficient intelligence can decipher that there are different drops being placed by, let's say, disclosure people, the government,
I see what you're saying. Breadcrumbs. What I refer
Yeah,
to as
right, and
breadcrumbs
that
are
one
there.
can decipher it.
Um, well, I've always left breadcrumbs every interview I ever do, except for the last 4 years. I think people can now go back through a lot of what I've said in the past and come back and say, "Oh, so that's what he was referring to." Now we know, because certain people have come out, whether it's Jim Lakatsky in his book or other folks. Um, I think I can't speak on behalf of the government and the other people. I suspect that. Um, what I can say is I think that we are at a point now where we don't have to leave the breadcrumbs um, that we have been in the past. I think the time has come for us to be even a little bit more straightforward and a little bit more clear. Um, the difficult part is when you're dealing with security clearances and NDAs, which everybody hates to hear. That's becoming a three-letter word that I think is probably going to be etched somewhere on my tombstone, and people are going to be throwing tomatoes at it, from here to eternity, because they hate it, and but they hate it because they don't really understand what it means, and why you have them. Um, those NDAs definitely get in the way of having a complete, transparent conversation. But I also think that we are having it. I think we've come a long, long ways. And as far as answering this specific question, as far as leaving breadcrumbs, I can't speak for anybody else. I don't know precisely what the government, because the government isn't just this one huge, if you will, monolithic enterprise. It's comprised of people, and those people, each of those people have their own interests and their own desires and their own agendas. And so I can't speak for them. I can only speak for me. Um, I think certainly if people were to look at all the talks I've given, and really look at them and listen to them closely, they will see that a lot more has been said than might necessarily be acknowledged.
Okay, this one comes from Ross Coulthart. Since you left the DoD, have you been warned not to talk publicly about certain things, and if so, what?
Yes, I have been warned. Uh, I've been warned, first of all, not to discuss classified information, which I've heeded thus far and will continue to do so. I've been threatened. There are individuals in the Pentagon that did not like what I do and how I did it. And so, once Secretary Mattis's public affairs officer, Dana White, left, they started to change the narrative a little bit. I was told that I would be labeled crazy, and that they would come after my security clearance, which they did. They actually did try to do that. And they were they were true to their word. But fortunately, I had some friends and allies that knew exactly what I was doing beforehand, and it wasn't quite so easy for them to be able to do that. But to put it simply, yeah, I've been warned.
So you've been warned. Have you ever gotten in trouble? Ross has a sub question. Have you gotten into trouble for acknowledging that the US has recovered non terrestrial materials?
Well, they're watching me very closely. They're trying. There's elements that are trying to get me into trouble. So that's why I walk a very fine line. I walk right up to that line, but I won't step over it, because they're waiting for me to screw up. They're waiting for me to say one word that I shouldn't say, and in order to use that against me and silence me. So yeah, I mean, I have gotten in trouble. They tried to come after my clearance, like I said, and unfortunately, I had to seek legal counsel to protect my constitutional rights to do so. It seems that they've backed off a little bit for now, but I'm not fooling myself. I know that there's still wolves circling just beyond the limit of the fire that I'm standing next to, waiting for an opportunity. So I'm very mindful of that. But I will also say that there's some really good elements. I've had an opportunity, sometimes through the worst of adversity, you get a chance to see people at their best. And I've learned that there are people on the inside that really do want to have the conversation and that want to see things done right. And these are senior people. Some of these are very, very, very senior people. And they were willing to put their professional careers on the line to defend me and protect me. And that that means a lot. That makes me feel good, because I've always been that way. I've could have called people out by name 3, 4 years ago just to defend my credibility, and I never did. People are now realizing that a lot of those people are now finally coming out of the shadows, and my life could have been a lot easier had I called them out, to defend me, but I didn't, because I made a promise to them that I would never reveal their identities until they were ready to do so. And that's just the way I am. I mean, to me, principles, mean everything. Either you're a person of principle or you're not. Doesn't matter how bad the going gets. You got to stick by your word. So it's been a mixed bag for me. Make sure we tell Ross here the full story, that even though I've had people coming after me, I've also had a lot of people rally around me. And to me, I focus on those folks. Those are the folks that it just makes you want to do this even more, because they're willing to get your back.
And are you allowed to say those folks' names?
They haven't come out of the shadows yet. They're in the process, and we'll let that play out. But I think it'll be quite obvious when they step out, because people are going to go, "Oh, that person! Oh my goodness, I didn't know that person was with Lou." Um, you know, so I'll leave it at that. Another breadcrumb, right?
Right, right. I have a follow up question to what you just said, which is there are wolves that are watching you like a hawk. Is there another reason outside of national security that they don't want you to disclose what you may disclose, or they're worried you may?
Yeah, I mean,
What is their worry outside of them?
there have been, you know, uh, forbidden truths, we can call them, if you will. There have been forbidden truths in the history of not just our country, but many countries. Truths that could upset a balance, a balance that's been around for a long time. Let me give you case in point. Let's say there were some people that were doing their job by running a UFO program in the past, but because certain things happened, presidents were no longer briefed, people in Congress were no longer briefed who should have been, and now they're running an operation that's uh, considered rogue, but it's still an important mission. Um, Turns out, all of a sudden now, let's say hypothetically, the cat's out of the bag. What's going to happen to those people when the government realizes they were running operations, for better or for worse, without any oversight, without any legal oversight, right? Who's going to be held accountable for that? The fact that they did not brief legally like they were supposed to certain members of Congress and committees and oversight committees and their chain of command. That's potentially criminal action. Let's say, I've said this before, let's say you have two competing companies. You have aerospace company A and aerospace company B. And aerospace company A, for whatever reason, gets a favor, and some sort of really exotic, game-changing material is provided to that company to do an analysis. Meanwhile, company B, who is competing fairly, doesn't get that material. Turns out company A now starts getting a lot of contracts, defense contracts, and becomes a multi-billion-dollar company, while company B, who never had the advantage of having that material, goes into bankruptcy. Hundreds of people lose their jobs, and stockholders lose their investment. Keeping in mind that both companies are supposed to be treated fairly and have fair competition when it comes to U.S. government contracts. Now what? Now what happens? Where's the liability? And by the way, now these companies are doing good things for the United States, but they got there because they had an unfair advantage, competitive advantage, potentially. Again, I'm not. This is hypothetical, right? Where's the liability there? You're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars worth of liability. And who made those decisions to do that? Who's going to be held culpable for that? The Security Exchange Commission would not be very happy to know that two publicly traded companies that were competing for a contract, one had an unfair advantage, the other went bankrupt. That's a problem. That's a real problem. And so you're talking about big money interests. You're talking about things that are going into that gray world that go beyond just government interests. You're talking about banking. You're talking about some of the biggest names on the planet that have a lot to lose or a lot to gain in hindsight. So, I think we always have to be careful that governments have always had interesting ties to certain interests, and that's true of all governments. That's not just the U.S. That's everybody, and we need to be mindful of that. Because you could be putting some people in a very uncomfortable position, and I'm aware of that, and that's why I've been very delicate how I approach this topic. I'm not trying to beat anybody up. I'm not trying to expose anybody and say, ah, ha, ha, gotcha. See there. I'm trying to have the conversation in a collaborative, meaningful way where everybody wins. Nobody has to get burned, right? It's not a zero sum game. I'm not.
Hypothetically, do they view it like that? Like there's a potential where everyone can win, or do they view it somewhat zero
Well, I
summed?
can't. I can't speak for them. I can't tell you what they think. All I can tell you is what I think and my approach. And my approach is to say, look, guys, we're not trying to expose anybody. This is not, I'm not trying, it's not a witch hunt, despite what you may see on social media where everybody wants their pound of flesh. That's not going to get us anywhere. We need to be adults about this. And we need to have a conversation that if you really want the truth to come out, you better be willing to compromise. This is, we're not gonna sit there and put people to be eaten by the lions just to satisfy someone's ego or beef that they might have with somebody else. The truth is more important than that. This is not about see, I told you so, or being vindicated. This is about having a conversation that can affect all of humanity, and we have to be willing to set aside some of that, if you will, and understandably so. You've got lots and lots of decades worth of people covering this up. I know there's a lot of animosity and resentment as a result of that by people saying, you've been lying to us for all this time, but we got to be willing to put that aside if we really want to move forward, in my opinion.
You're referring to animosity from the general public or animosity from some of these wolves that
No,
you
general
referenced?
public who want their pound of flesh because people have been covering this topic up for too long, knowing that it's real and lying to the American people. Having a chance to talk to some people in the Vatican, they describe these flaming Roman shields in the sky that would follow them from battlefield to battlefield. What they call the eclipus, which is the shape of the Roman shield. That's documented. That's there. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't read it from Jacques Vallée, but from my understanding, Jacques Vallée even wrote a little bit about that. But I've seen that evidence myself. There is documentation of these strange things in the sky going back a long, long time. So I don't think it's necessarily modern. Maybe our understanding is a little bit more advanced and maybe consider that modern, but I don't think we're dealing with a new phenomenon. I think we may be dealing with a new recognition, and perhaps, hopefully, at some point, a new understanding. But I don't think this is a new phenomenon to mankind. I think we've been faced with this phenomenon for quite some time.
You mentioned millennia, which is thousands of years. I'm wondering, potentially tens of thousands, potentially millions, or do you think it's cut off around 9,000 or so?
Well, that's hard to tell because we only, as a species, Homo sapiens sapien, have been around roughly for 100,000 years. And we only really gotten into written language in the last 6,000 years, really. And been gone from, hunter gatherers to more of an agrarian type society, organized society, which is, if you take 100,000 years and you compare the last 5,000 years, really only the 5% of our entire time rummaging around on this planet has been in somewhat of a civilized fashion. And then if you look at that to the context of, it's been, only in the last, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, we understood, the Archimedes steam engine, right? And really didn't even fully appreciate it until the Industrial Revolution just a couple hundred years ago. So now you're talking at 0.2% of mankind's time on Earth. We've been industrialized, we've been civilized. So how much of our own history do we really know? Well, we can go back 5,000 years pretty easily. 8,000 years, things start to get a little murky, right? And anything much beyond that, we really have no clue about. And the question is, have we as a species been aware of this phenomenon much longer? Well, let's look at what we do know. The general consensus is that the American population, when I say American, I don't mean United States, I mean North America, South America, Central American population, really began about 20,000 years ago with during the land bridge, when you had a migration coming over the land bridge and settling this part of the planet. But in reality, it turns out now that a lot of scientists believe that there were many migrations, and many migrations before that primary migration 20,000 years ago. In fact, there may have been multiple migrations going back, perhaps even 100,000 years ago. So, is it possible that our society was aware of these things, maybe even interacted with these things in a certain fashion? Sure, it's possible. Absolutely, it's possible. I mean, most of our history we have no idea about. It's like spending an entire day and having amnesia, except for the last 5 minutes before you go to bed. Where the
Right.
hell was I? What was I doing? What did I eat? Who did I speak to? What did I say?
What I'm wondering is what you're referencing is written history, and I'm curious about archaeological evidence that you're aware of
Ah, so let
or
me
that
give you
potentially
an
exists.
interesting. Yeah, so let me give you a real world example, and I'm not going to either refute or defend it. But again, I live here in Wyoming, and there is a legend here called the Little People of the Peori Mountains. And for generations, the indigenous people have reported what appeared to be this fearsome pygmy warrior tribe of humanoid type creatures that lived in the mountains. And for many, many, many years, it was completely considered myth, just
Folklore, right? Yeah.
folklore. And it turns out that scientists began uncovering artifacts up in the mountains that, to some degree, reinforced the notion that there was some sort of small hominoid type creature living in the mountains. They found small tools. They found, small bones that appeared to be coming from some, human like creature. Now, I don't know. I don't know the details thoroughly. I haven't had a chance to really explore it or study it. But that part is true. That people are now beginning to look back and say, "Well, wait a minute, is that possible?" Because we're starting to find archaeological evidence. Um, so it's interesting. Here, I can walk up into the Bighorn Mountains, and they're pulling out spearheads that are 11,000 years old. Now think about that for a minute. 11,000 years old. If that spearhead could talk, what people did it come from? What were they hunting? What did this place look like? Environments change in a blink of an eye. Look at the Sahara Desert in 5,000 years. There was a lot of wildlife living in the Sahara region before it became a desert. And that was in recent human history, by the way. We were inhabiting the planet when that happened. There are drawings on the side of rock walls that illustrate alligators, crocodiles, if you will, and animals that live not just on the savanna but in the wetlands, all cohabitating there. So this Earth is very dynamic. Every time we have for us, it seems like a long time, but every time we have an ice age, every roughly 10, 15,000 years, the entire topography of Earth changes. The climate changes, animals change, people change, right? Um, I think it's very possible that there is potentially some sort of archaeological evidence. The question is, would we recognize it if we saw it? And that's another big question we have to ask ourselves. Let me ask you this as a scientist, Curt. If I said to you, Curt, you have a task. You can make it out of whatever you want, any material you want. Your goal is to, in a million years, you have to create something now that will last a million years to prove you were here. What would you do? How would you do it? Think about it. Go ahead. No, 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 no. Let's. I love you, man, but we're gonna have this mental exercise right now. I think it's important. And by the way, it's not a trick question, and I'm not playing gotcha. Just, what would you give me? Just some examples that you might throw out there to say, okay, I would make something out of this or out of that. Or
There are some meta materials that seem to be harder than diamond, so whatever's our hardest material, it would be made out of that. Also, just so you know, I don't classify myself as a scientist. I'm more of a hobbyist, let's say. So that's
okay,
what I would do.
fair enough. So you'd find some sort of hard material that would outlast just about anything else on Earth, right? Where would you put that
Right,
material? Where
right,
would you put
right.
it?
Orbit is one place.
Okay, and hopefully a non-retrograde orbit, right? So geosynchronous, and hopefully nothing would perturb it. In a million years, chances are something would, but okay, hypothetically in orbit, good. Here on Earth, it's really hard to make anything that lasts more than a few thousand years. You can even make the pyramids and look at them now and say, wow, those things are 5,000 years old, and they don't look so great. And probably in another 5,000 years, they're not going to look good at all. And they might last eventually till you might have a little hill of sand in 100,000 years, but that's going to be about it. And that's made out of rock, right? Mount Mushmore, same thing. It's going to be gone in 10,000 years. You won't probably even recognize it. It'll be too worn. Even mountains in millions of years become deserts, right? Time moves on. Then you have the subduction zones of Earth that eventually, if you wait long enough on the surface of the planet, it all gets recycled anyways. It's all going to get sucked down into the mantle and get spit out the other end and as new land. So nothing is indelible on this planet. It's constantly changing, and to create something that can last the sands of time, so to speak, is a lot harder than one might think. The few examples we have here on Earth that are man-made, you can look to the pyramids, you can look at things like Stonehenge, but that's a blink of an eye. Those were just made a few thousand years ago, and they're not going to be around, for a whole lot of time. That's just not the way Earth is. So if we're trying to find some sort of marker, chances are you're not going to find it buried in the earth unless it only happened maybe the last 5,000 years ago or so, right? Even some of the most dramatic examples of terraforming. Let's look at, for example, the meteor impact crater in Arizona. It happened 60,000 years ago. That's already filling in. In another 100,000 years from now, you may not even know anything ever happened because of the processes of Earth and what this planet does. It's constantly erasing what's on the surface, and is constantly burying what lies beneath deeper and deeper and deeper until eventually it gets recycled. So that's a hard question. What would last long enough for us to go back and say, wow, this is an indicator of alien life on this planet 100,000 years ago? What would you have to do to achieve that, to accomplish that? It's a lot harder than one might think. And then again, would you recognize it? One might say, well, DNA is a perfect example. If you wanted to do something that was enduring for humanity, that we could look back 100,000 years ago and say, yes, that was absolutely manipulated by an intelligent life form. Well, deoxyribonucleic acid may be one way to do it. You can put coding and sequencing in there that will perpetuate over time, and yes, you'll have some degradation over generations. But in essence, you could do something that way. And basically, it's a biological marker, right? So we have to be careful when we say we look for evidence, because evidence isn't just necessarily a spearhead found in the Bighorn Mountains from 11,000 years ago. It's not necessarily a pyramid sitting in the middle of a desert. It could be far more sophisticated than that. You said put it in orbit, right? Well, what if we put that, rather than in orbit, we put it into the human body?
Are there places that we should be looking for evidence that you feel like we're not? So, for example, I mentioned archaeological investigation sites. The reason I brought that up is some people say craft were found. Okay, but you're also saying there may be other markers, maybe, possibly, biologically, for example.
Near Earth celestial bodies like the moon, where you don't have atmospheric friction, you don't have the tectonic processes that we have here on Earth that are constantly recycling. Someone might want to put something on the moon. If you want to, reminiscent of what was it, 2001 Space Odyssey, right, where you have these monolithic markers. That's certainly one way to do it. You could put something where you don't have those same processes occurring, where maybe you might be able to extend your time twice as long for leaving some sort of archaeological evidence. The evidence could be right here, could be right in front of us, could be within genetic sequencing. It could even be more obvious than that. It could be the very fact that we're alive and we're on this planet is an example of some intelligent life somewhere making a decision that life needs to exist on this planet. We need to be open to all of that. We really do. I think We need to cast a very wide net. And this is why I always say all options have to be on the table until they're not on the table, because you might be surprised. Something that's super, super intelligent probably isn't going to build a pyramid that's only going to last, 20,000 years. They're going to do something that's far more enduring, something that will really be, no kidding,
Mr. Elizondo has called the UAP craft multiple times, made comments about not knowing who is piloting them. This seems like an assumption, at least without proof. Does this mean there is proof, let's call that evidence because proof in science doesn't exist, that these are craft with pilots?
Well, let's break it down. Craft. Craft is a noun. It's a physical object that allows the transportation of something from point A to point B. Whether it's a hovercraft, right, or a spacecraft or an aircraft, it's a vehicle. And so what defines a vehicle? Well, physical material. There's something to it, nuts and bolts. I've made it very clear already my opinion about my assertion that there is material that is related to this topic that has been recovered in the past. That's all I can say about that. But that's why I use the term craft. It's maybe not the best term, but to me, it's fairly accurate, at least until I can find another term that's more accurate. As far as piloted or manned, I'm not sure manned is the right way to say, because that means there's a human behind it, and we're not sure that's the case. But being piloted or intelligently controlled. Well, the way they maneuver and the way they respond to us, think of in the scientific world, stimulus versus reaction. We can provoke and elicit responses from these things. So, Dave Fravor said when I came in and to close the gap on this thing reacted to me. First of all, it pointed at me, and then it maintained a safe distance and mirrored my maneuvers. So there is some sort of intelligence behind it. That's not random. That's not Brownian movement, right? That's a deliberate action.
There's justification in calling it craft, other than that there may be pilots.
Correct. And something or someone is making a decision how these things perform and react. So I think it's fair to say that they are intelligently controlled craft of some sort. Now, much beyond that, I think that's up for debate.
Are there potential photos that exist that show occupants in some of these quote unquote craft?
Well, there's a lot of photos that show a lot of things. The question is, are they real? Are they legitimate?
Are there potential photos that have potentially deemed as legitimate that have that quality?
There are very compelling photos out there that seem to show something inside, some sort of occupancy, and I'll leave it at that, because it gets really murky much beyond that. And there's a lot that can be speculated. And so I try to avoid speculation as much as possible. But yes, I've spoken to enough people, firsthand knowledge that not only report the crafts that we know exist, but potentially some sort of intelligence inside these vehicles.
You mentioned it gets murky. Murky as in low resolution, or murky? What do you mean by murky?
I mean, in every aspect, the source of the information, how the information was obtained, under what circumstances, resolution of photographic evidence, all of it. And so that's why we have to be very careful.
Ross Coulthart said it would be good to offer a deal to those who kept the program secret. They get some immunity in exchange for getting us the truth. I think he referenced truth and reconciliation. Would you guys back a change.org style petition for this? Do you think that the others would like it?
Absolutely. I think Ross is 100% correct. I think we need to offer amnesty from criminal and civil prosecution if we want them to come out of the shadows. There's a lot of pressure right now, and I'm sure they don't. Whoever's part of that cabal doesn't appreciate that type of pressure. And so, if we could offer some sort of truth and reconciliation, I think something to that effect would be very helpful in this cause. And say, look, We're not going to label you. In fact, we'll give you anonymity and confidentiality. What we'll do is if you provide us this information, we'll make sure that kind of like a witness protection program, except for, no one will ever know you were part of this except for very few people. Um, I think that's a great idea. I think that's what we should be doing.
Ross suggested in the previous interview a hashtag called NASA Tell the Truth. And so we ran with that. And part of that was tongue in cheek. But then it had me wondering, well, what would be an effective way of getting this information disclosed quicker and more truthfully?
Well, NASA, look, you guys, it's working. NASA is now starting to have conversations, and the director of NASA himself is beginning to entertain questions about this topic. I think that's great. I don't think that's tongue in cheek at all. It's working. I'd give yourself a big pat on the back, because I just saw a headline 2 days ago where he's talking with Avi Loeb, and they're going to be having this conversation. So, hey, look, don't look now, but you just achieved part of what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Lou. What would you recommend? What's another avenue? So Storm Area 51 is a horrible idea by
No,
many
you're
accounts.
going to get a bunch of young kids in trouble and potentially really hurt.
This person, James, recommended a change.org petition. Truth and Reconciliation is also recommended by Ross. What do you see as an efficient?
I think we also have to continue to take an active role in our politics and voting people in who want transparency. We have been victimized too long by our ignorance. We have allowed people to get into the government that don't have our best interests at heart, that are motivated by politics and not diplomacy, and where information is traded like a commodity. And so secrecy is something that is abused for the wrong reasons, and I think that's problematic. There are some points of light right now in Congress. We see between Senator Harry Reid, which is absolute American hero. You have on the other side of the aisle Marco Rubio. You have Congressman Gallego and Tim Burchett and Walker and some other folks now finally coming out and saying, "Hey, enough's enough." That's fantastic. That's how you make a difference, and making sure that the general public goes to them and encourages them and tells them, thank you for doing this. That goes a long way. These people are taking a huge risk to have this conversation. And the more they hear from the public that it's okay to pursue this, the more willing they're going to be to do it and to have the conversation. And it's working. I just came back from DC myself. I'm not going to say who I spoke with, but that goes a long way. That means a lot to them. And it gives them the motivation in the top cover to start asking the hard questions and start poking the executive branch in the chest and saying, all right, what do you know about this? And oh, by the way, Secretary of the Air Force Kendall, with all due respect, don't come back and say it's not a priority just because, we can't prove it's a threat or not. That's like saying a submarine pops out of the Potomac River next to Washington, D.C., and because it's not wearing an American flag and you don't know if it's a threat, it's not a priority. That's the wrong answer. That's again, with all due respect to Secretary Kendall, lest we forget who you work for, it's not up to you to decide what is a national priority. Let me remind you, it's not your Air Force, it's our Air Force, and you're doing a job we told you to do. And if you don't want to do it, or you are or unable to do it, then we'll find somebody else who can, and you can go back to doing what you were doing before. That's my word of advice. I paid my dues in the trenches, and I know what I swore to do and uphold. Sometimes people in positions of power need to be reminded of that by the people, by the way. So that's what you guys can do.
A tip focused on military encounters. Did you ever come across cases where people had experienced high strangeness, similar to that found on Skinwalker Ranch? For example, have any pilots reported things like the hitchhiker effect?
I want to answer this as accurately as I can without giving anybody the wrong impression. There's a reason why the 6 observable is biological effects. Okay. That by definition is high strangeness. People after an encounter experiencing certain physiological and psychological things. Um, Again, let me to put it succinctly, yes, but not the same as the Skinwalker Ranch. Um,
Differences being,
well, Skinwalker was looking at a lot of the paranormal aspects, as you say in the vernacular, shapeshifters, and I guess
I see.
was
I
put
see.
once as ghosts and poltergeist, that type of activity, whereas ATIP was looking at nuts and bolts UFOs. But there were some parallels. Some people, and the problem is we really don't know enough about that, about the UAP issue to really speak cogently on that. People have had biological effects, and that's as far as we were prepared to go at the time. Because that could be quantified and qualified. You can look at physiology and morphology, and you can look at things like that, and you can look at tissues and things like that. You can quantify and qualify. The other stuff is a lot harder, especially anything dealing with a psychological episode. When I say psychological, I mean in a bad way, not like it's made up. I mean everything we do is interpreted psychologically, right? There's a mental process that goes along with it, with a physical experience. PTSD is a perfect example. PTSD is very, very real, but it's a psychological response to a physiological and emotional type situation. And very much the same way, people will process data differently, just like PTSD. Uh, and no different in this topic. You have people in some cases I've talked to who, like Dave Fravor, just wants to get behind the wheel of one of these things and learn how to fly it. Then you have other people who've been deeply and emotionally impacted by this and still carry that with them for whatever reason. They've come up close and personal, and it's caused some sort of conflict internally. You say hitchhiker effect. Some folks swear that once you have one of these encounters, there's this hitchhiker effect, and now all of a sudden all sorts of weird things start happening to you and your family. um, there's an individual that I'm very, very, very close to, who was very senior in this effort, who at some point, when it comes out of the shadows, you should probably have this conversation with that person, um, because they'll tell you absolutely yes. But again, I don't have any data that can be quantified or qualified, so I cannot speak definitively on it. I think we have to remain open, um, that there's a whole lot of things that are possible.
And I know you said you don't have data that's quantifiable, but I'm curious about this hitchhiker effect or the sixth observable. Is that associated with proximity to the craft or length of time looking at the craft, like another variable?
Damn,
What
Curt,
is
you're
associated with
you're
this?
great questions, man. Let me take a pass on that for now. Let me that will be addressed. Um,
Sure. We'll get to
Great question.
with the phenomenon being so evasive. What level of confidence do we have that global disclosure will be a net positive for engagement with it? As an analogy, we know hornets exist, but poking the hornet's nest is ill advised.
Well, let's define engagement. Is engagement the same as poking? I don't think so. International engagement is getting everybody on the same sheet of music about the topic. It's not necessarily being provocative. It's not necessarily poking, quote unquote, the hornet's nest. What it is, it's an acknowledgement that the hornet's nest exists, and that hornets exist, and we should probably understand them. I'm not at all advocating that we go and poke the hornet's nest. What I'm advocating is that we need to study the hornet, and we need to study where the hornet lives and how it lives, and its relationship to its environment, and ultimately its relationship to us, if any.
I think the last time we spoke about transmedium, that it would go from
Mhm.
water to air, back and forth. Is there any evidence of transmedium with respect to rock? Can it move through solid material?
I've heard people speculate that. We haven't seen that, but there were some scientific models, specifically a couple calculations, that I was privy to in the mathematics specifically, that indicate if you can get a certain number below a zero, then quote unquote, it can cut through rock like butter. But I I'm not a math expert, and I'm certainly not going to validate or verify that because I don't know. All I saw were a bunch of numbers and letters of the alphabet put in front of me in a very long strain of what, I presume to be valid equations. But I don't know.
Potentially, have there been biological samples recovered from craft?
Let's rephrase that question. Have there potentially been biological samples recovered? Yes.
Mm,
I'm not going to expound anymore on
right, right,
that.
right. So let's forget about the craft.
And be careful when I say that. I'm being purposely very open and vague at the same time, right?
Has he ever considered that when the UAP changes direction or speed, it may actually be warping space-time, like certain warp drives I'm sure you've heard of? That way, the space-time around the UAP is warped, and so it's not technically moving, and thus the biological entities, if there are one or any, wouldn't feel G-forces. Have you considered that? Essentially, is what Senzubin is asking.
Yeah, it's right on the money. Except for it is moving, but that the principles of what that question is are right on the money. Yes.
What can we do personally and even societally to prepare ourselves and others for a post-disclosure world?
I'm not sure we need to prepare at all. I think we're perfectly prepared. I have faith in human beings that we will look at this from a rational perspective. Our paradigm is challenged every day. We just had in the media, China launch a hypersonic cruise missile around the world. That's a change in the way we see ourselves, especially with potential foreign adversaries. We have our paradigms change every day. People are told that they have cancer every day. People are told that spouses are cheating on them every day. People are told that they're pregnant and are going to have kids every day. People are told about the death of a loved one every day. We're human beings. That's part of life. I think I'm not sure there's anything we can do to prepare. I think just be ourselves and be willing to ask the hard questions, and have the patience to find the answers. Let's not be so quick to jump into some sort of preconceived narrative just because it makes us feel good, right? Because we all want to understand things that we don't. We all have this natural fear of things we can't understand. We must be tempted not to create an artificial narrative just so we feel better. We need to really explore this for what it is, and have the courage to do so. That would be my advice.
The last time we spoke, there were two comments that you said that stood out to me. Well, one was the somber heard around the world, in a sense, and then you clarified that, or you added to that by saying sobering. Oh, I was wondering.
Let me start with by somber or sobering. Imagine everything you've been taught, whether it's through Sunday school or through regular formal education in school, or what our political leaders have told us. And yes, even maybe our mothers and fathers around the dinner table have told us, or maybe at bedtime, about who we are, right? And our background and our past. What if all of that turned out to be not entirely accurate? In fact, the very history of our species, the meaning, what it means to be a human being and our place in this universe. What if all that is now in question? What if it turns out that a lot of the things that we thought were one way aren't? Are we prepared to have that honest question with ourselves? Are we prepared to recognize that we're not at the top of the food chain, potentially? That we're not the alpha predator, that we are maybe somewhere in the middle? It's interesting because I was having discussion with a friend not too long ago. A really, we call them graybeards in the government. Really, really smart guy. I'm not going to mention his name, but I was talking to him probably a couple months ago, And this is a guy who was always paid to solve the hard problems for the U.S. government. Cold War. How do we solve that? Right? How do we do these big things? How do we go in and beat the Russians at their own game? So this guy I respect tremendously, and we had a conversation. He said, Lou, mankind's been around for a little while, and for most of that time, mankind's been around. We've been smack in the middle of the food chain. We've been, we ate a lot of things, and a lot of things ate us, and that's just the bottom line. And about 70,000 years ago, something fundamentally changed. Something changed, and our species was instantly catapulted to the very top of our planet as far as predatory animals. And now all of a sudden, we became the most feared. We were the most lethal and the most successful. And in fact, most of the large species that existed on this planet went extinct because of us. Believe it or not, because we was eating all of it. There were a couple species that did very, very well with our ascension, our immediate ascension. And we brought a couple species with us. The dog is an example, where the dog species benefited greatly with mankind's ascension as the alpha predator and wound up succeeding as well, doing very well off of that. That changed the entire global landscape of our planet almost overnight. Large animals went extinct because of us. What if it turns out that there's another species that is even higher on that ladder than we are? Do we need the social institutions that we have today? Will we need governmental and religious organizations that we have today if it turns out that there is something else or someone else that is technologically more advanced and perhaps from an evolutionary perspective more advanced? Have we been wasting our time all this time, or are we doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing? Are we? Does it turn out that mankind is in fact just another animal in the zoo? Or because we thought ourselves as a zookeeper before, but maybe we're just another exhibit inside the zoo. What would that mean to us? So when I say sombering and sobering, I mean that there's going to come a point in this conversation where we're going to have to do a lot of reconciling with ourselves, whatever that means, from whatever philosophical background you have. This is going to impact every single one of us the same and yet equally and yet differently. And I think that's important. Do we find ourselves in a situation where history may have to be rewritten? So that's what I meant. Science and religion, when you are standing at their base, they could not be any farther apart. Think of a pyramid, going to the Great Pyramid of Giza and standing on one side of the pyramid and say, this is science. And then walking around all the way to the other side of the pyramid and say, this is faith, this is religion. And the two could not be further apart from each other. And yet, when you start to climb that pyramid,
I see what you're saying.
On whichever side you go on, they start to get closer and closer together. In fact, at some point, at the very top, the difference between science and religion are indistinguishable. They are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are together. They're one. They're one and the same. And in fact, I think part of the problem is that in science and in faith, we're asking two fundamental different questions. This is why the two don't get along down at the base of the pyramid. This is why they seem so opposite, because one is asking how and the other is asking why. And they're two different questions. And that's why the two don't seem to comport with one another. But ironically enough, the further you go up the ladder, the more you realize they actually require each other, they actually lean on each other, they actually support each other. And at the very top, there's no difference between science and religion. They become one. and they support each other. I think, anyways. That's my perspective from what I've seen in life.
Based upon what you've learned, Lou, would you consider yourself to be an idealist or a materialist? And if you
Ooh,
are unsure what those words mean,
no,
let
I
me
know
know.
what they are. Is there an option C?
Hmm.
Can
Which would be what, mix?
can it be both or neither?
Yeah, that's something I've been wondering. Is there a duality between those two? There's plenty of dualities in math and physics where you think it's the option between two, but it turns out that they're equivalent ways of describing a system.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure it's an either or. I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive. I think, my background was science. Um, in science, I found my solace, which I enjoyed. I grew up kind of a angry young kid, had some tough times as a kid. But science to me was it was unwavering. She was always there for me. She never lied to me, and so I get lost in science, and I do believe in the scientific method. It works. I mean, is it perfect? No, but it's the best thing that we got right now that we know to test and apply theories. Um, but at the same time, there's something more you said about human consciousness. Can't prove it. There's no mathematical formula, no physical evidence to prove consciousness, and yet here we are having a conversation. So, um, I think I don't think the two are mutually. I don't consider myself a materialist or an idealist. Like I said, it's when I make fun of the fact that I said I love humanity. It's humans I don't like, right? How is that possible, right? Because humanity is a collective of all the humans, and yet, but um, probably a little bit of both. Probably a little bit. I think there's an indelible aspect to the human being that transcends physicality. We have a body, obviously, and we have a brain, and our brain is inextricably tied for metabolic processes to survive to the body. The heart has to pump blood to get blood to the brain, otherwise the brain dies. And in the same respect, the brain is regulating all the autonomic processes for the body. So, breathing, which is automatic, thank God for most of us, anyways, and heartbeat and temperature and whatnot. So the brain is a biological organ that is inextricably tied to the overall vehicle, which is the body, and that's organic as well. But there's probably something more to the human being. There's probably something more that is not necessarily physical. Because a computer has a processor, a computer has a body, right? The laptop I'm talking to you on right now, and it's got a processor that's thinking, if you will, for the computer, but it's not a conscious living being. It's not a sentient being. So the question is, what is that extra component, that extra ingredient that makes us human, that makes us a living, breathing, not only animal, but truly human, what separates us from everything else on this planet? And there's that third ingredient can be described potentially in cultures as the soul or the id or the chi, or what, put your nom de jour you want on there. But I think a lot of people agree that there's something different. Case in point, the notion of love. Um, you can't really describe it. It's hard to describe. You can't see it. You can't touch it and taste it, but it's there and it motivates a lot of people's actions. In fact, love to some degree actually works against individual survival. And yet, a mother's instinct to throw herself in front of a train to save her child is almost reflexive. There's something there that recognizes the value of human life, human dignity. I could be in a car accident and lose use of my arms and my legs, but I'm still Lou Elizondo. I could suffer a traumatic brain injury and have a severe TBI and be mentally impaired, but I'm still Lou Elizondo. What makes Lou Elizondo Lou is something a little bit different, something that you can't really put your finger on. And so back to this duality, materialist versus idealist. I'm probably a little bit of both because I believe in science, but I also know that there's limitations to science and there's limitations to human beings and there's limitations to you and me and everybody else. And that's okay. And that there's aspects to being human that are probably potentially more human than human, to use an old cliche.
Given the clues Lou, DeLong, and others have been laying down, it seems like we're dealing with crypto-terrestrials, not necessarily aliens. Is this what Admiral Byrd found during Operation High Jump?
It's absolutely possible that this is something that's been on this planet for a very long time, and it's just as natural to Earth as we are. It could very well be its own. This is crazy as it may sound, could be its own animal kingdom. Just like the hidden world of protozoa and whatnot, of the microorganisms in that animal kingdom that was invisible to us until just a couple hundred years ago. Could be. The likelihood of it, I don't really know, but it's it is a possibility. You can't say no.
Matt Wood asks, Lou, have you had any holy shit moments where you learned a truth about something so over the top that it wasn't even on your question list? Speaking of question lists.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Let me continue then, so you have more to riff off of. How many times have extraordinary revelations occurred to you as you were learning about this phenomenon?
So as it relates to UAP, there were a few. I'm beginning to put my thoughts down on paper. There were quite a few, each time it challenged my perspective on things. It challenged my understanding of the universe and our place in it. But not quite yet prepared to have that conversation. But I will have it at some point.
Did you ever lose sleep over it?
All the time.
Watch more podcast clips now on our YouTube channel. Go to Livewire Podcast Clips and watch more great podcast videos just like this one.